quite IMAX, but yes, no, is that, can you see at the back? I'll talk about this in a minute, just to give you a bit of context of who I am and what I do. Now live in Brighton, but similar to Zaf, I was born in Britain, but of mixed heritage, and back in January I began an MA in photography through Falmouth University. I'm already a working photographer. I've been a working photographer now for about 6.5 years, and you come through my working practice, I'm always providing images for someone else's brief. Sometimes I get, a bit of leeway about what that might look like and what the outcome might be, but in the main I'm thinking about how's this person going to use my images, usually to sell something. And I studied fine art and photography back in the late 1980s, so there's part of me that felt there's got to be a little bit more. I've got to use photography to somehow talk about my heart and people's hearts that I'm curious about. So when I began the MA, they obviously asked us to start thinking about things in our lives that we might be interested in pursuing as a project for a consolidated period of time. So in my case, 2 years. So my final major project will be just coming to a close this time next year. Roughly concurrent with that timing is when Jeff proposed that I get involved with Cohere. Now, for me, what I was already thinking about was partly because of what's currently happening in the Western world, and I don't want to use the dreaded B word. You can guess what that is. I was questioning, so where am I from? I've got an Italian father. I've got all this heritage that I know something of, but I'm not fully aware of it. I was born in Leicester. I've lived in multiple places across the UK. Where do I feel at home? Where do I belong? And I actually began to realise that I don't know that I belong in any specific place, and I never have done. And that was quite a revelation at nearly 52 years old. So when Jeff approached me, I was thinking very much about, well, obviously we had the core project was about refugees and what it's like to arrive. So I had to look into myself and go, well, I'm not a refugee. How can I bring my experience and my understanding of what it feels like to be out of place to a photographic project? So for the first part of Cohere, which was the work that was done at home in Manchester and at the V&A in London, the work was very much, I approached it as being a bit of a backdrop in a sense to the main performers who were refugees themselves. So I'll come on to this as a whole sequence in a minute, but I basically shot a big sequence of about 14, 15 images that had, I don't know if you can see them too clearly, there are larger versions in a minute, that had images of people touching something that either brought with them from another country or that meant something to them and grounded them in their new home or their new quest for belonging. So there were a lot of images like this, people's hands holding these items. As time has moved on and my MA's moved on, and we knew that Cohere was going to be presented as a more visual project in Hull International Photography Festival, which we opened only this weekend. I started to think about my work, and hopefully this is a little bit where it relates to you folks. I started to think about my work as each individual image is an individual word. And if I was to sequence images, can I create a visual sentence that might, in the long run, become something akin to a poem or a song? And in my mind there, I was thinking about kind of mythological sagas like the Odyssey. Not that I'm going to create something as big as that, but I was thinking about that there's a massive amount of mythology that's about people traveling somewhere, and usually they end up returning home. They return somewhere, but it was a concept to me that I hadn't really ever thought about in terms of visual work. So by the time it comes to Hull International Photography Festival, I've started to, I was saying this earlier to Rosalind, I've got all this work, all these images, which some of which already are starting to make sense together, others which feel very disparate. And I had, like I said, 15, 20 images like this, and I began a massive editing process, which I'm guessing, if some of you are writers, is probably quite similar. You get your first draft down, you've got all this stuff, and actually it sort of feels like there's something in there, but I don't quite know what it is. And in order to get to it, I've actually got to kill my darlings and throw the majority of my stuff out there and really start to strip it back. So the sequence that I ended up showing at Hull, and this is the first sequence that I kind of felt, okay, this feels like my first sentence, my first complete sentence, almost like a baby. Oh, I'm speaking finally. Now, I don't know at this stage if this sequence is at the beginning of the song, the middle of the song, at the end of the song. I thought, when I first put it together, it was the beginning. But actually, having seen it on the wall at Hull International Photography, I started to go, no, I'm not there yet. For me, it's working as a sequence, it's saying something, but it's not, I don't know if it's the beginning, the middle, or the end yet. And that's actually quite exciting. So, I don't know if you can see, let me tell you what, before I move on to each individual image, you can see how they work together, and hopefully you find it quite intriguing. It's asking you questions as much as it's being obvious about what it is. So in that, I guess for me, it's more perhaps like poetry, in that you can bring your own interpretation to the work as much as me saying this is what it's about. I just want to read to you, just bear with me technically while I find where I move on next. So this is what this is the blurb that I put with the piece of work. I'll read it out to you. So I'm calling each sequence cantos. So as you guys probably know, perhaps Zaf can correct me, a canto is a short sequence within a poem, or a single line within a poem, is that right? But I know in Italian it also means song. And I kind of like that, obviously being half Italian, that there's that dual meaning. The whole project is going to be called A Fractured Glass at Future in the Earth. And that's, for me, I was very aware of how fragile we are. And no matter where we come from, there's only one place in the end we're actually all going to commonly end up. And that's in the Earth. So Canto 1, that sequence, presents one image sequence from the larger body of work, A Fractured Glass at Future in the Earth. This work attempts to understand the experiences of mixed heritage and migration, especially where the quest for home and belonging come into play. It is rooted in personal experience and the desire to create a form of reportage, in inverted commas, from the spaces between the factual, the fictional, the historic and the geographic. The work is deliberately built as visual sequences with a sentence structure, hence the title canto, that, alongside other sequences, builds into a longer visual poem or song and reflects the epic nature of many global mythological sagas and poems. So, you know, I'm nothing if not ambitious, put it that way. I'll just take you through each individual. So here you go. This is the work at Hull, as presented this weekend. A little bit of a wider view with a bit of that's Kani's work, who's also involved in the project, and that's a still from Jeff's film, which you'll be seeing later on. So I'm very much, in a lot of my work, I'm a portrait photographer. I do a lot of commercial portraits, but I'm really interested in people. And I'm trying to find, as I said in that little bit of blurb, I'm trying to find a way that I use the reality of people to create an unreality. And I quite often don't know what that's going to look like. So I might find a subject, and it's, you know, we book some time in the diary and I start shooting, and usually it's quite informal. I'm chatting and the camera's there, and I might take a few pictures, and I never quite know what it is that's going to speak to me. So this image is actually of an Iranian friend of mine, and she's talking about her grandparents who gave her this prayer mat. It doesn't matter if you need to know that or not to me. What is interesting and curious to me is her gesture, and there's a space here. So these things start to speak to me as I'm trying to build this sequence together. And as I've been building the work, I've been using scrapbooks and just throwing things onto the page and looking at disparate elements of things I've cut out of magazines, very, very old work that I maybe picked up, maybe did, 20 or 30 years ago. And I started to realize that some of this work was very, very, it kind of had a power to it that I didn't fully understand myself. So this kind of looks to me, when I first created it, like a sea with a sun. It's actually a little mirror. And I thought, okay, this kind of work, although it's not directly photographic in some ways, needs to be present in the project going forward. And I think for me as well, what it starts to show me is that maybe rather than having a photograph of a mirror, that actually maybe things like a real mirror need to be in the final work. So I'm kind of learning as I go with each edit. So these are the two I mentioned earlier, which are the hands of a guy called Junior and a lovely lady called Sue. Sue is a refugee from Ghana. She brought with her Twi grammar book, which she's had since she was at school, and it's this really well-thumbed grammar book. It's printed on that really horrible old toilet paper that shouldn't have been toilet paper, that was really shiny, and you think, well, it's not really any good to anybody, but it's okay for printing on. So and Junior had a comb, which is the Afro comb. He said, I've had it for 12 years. I remember it as something as a child. I clean it every day. So these things kind of started to bring their meaning to the work for me, and kind of points me in a certain direction. And then just also, I can't throw out my kind of documentary background, my editorial background. So quite often I'm out in the world and I'm looking for, well, I'm not even aware of necessarily what I'm looking for. I know that I might be in a certain location and something suddenly suggested itself to me. And this was actually a shot that was taken way back of just 5 Chinese, they must have been tourists, they were just staring out to sea for ages and ages at Cuckmere Haven. And it was one of those moments that I snapped it. I wasn't quite sure where it was going to be in the project, if at all. And again, of that sequence of 5 images, I spent probably, all these first 4 came together very quickly. I don't know why, but the final one I had about 10 different drafts with 10 different images in. And in the end, I kind of had to go with a sort of symmetry across the page. So there, she's looking out, they're looking out, and there's a similarity in tone. You can't see it so great on here, but there's a similarity in tone of the images that that was the one that was meant to be in the final image. I just thought I'd quickly show you a few bits of other stuff that I'm putting together. So this is another sequence from my work in progress MA portfolio. It just shows you that I'm still kind of playing with lots of different ideas and kind of pushing the sense of creating stories, creating, how do things work in juxtaposition with each other. So this is an interesting one. So that's my DNA test before it went off to the place in Bedford or something, or Ireland, wherever it was. So what, was it Dublin? Yeah. 23andMe it was. Okay. Yeah. So I decided that I needed to find out a bit more about my heritage. I thought I was half Italian and half English. Turns out I'm not. I'm not quite as dramatic as Zaf. I have about 30% Irish and UK heritage, but then there's this huge part of me which is French and German. So it turns out that my roots come from the Holy Roman Emperor Constantine. My surname is Bellerini. He had private bodyguards who were called the Bellorum. So one Bellorum was a Bellerini. So this whole kind of who am I, what am I, is kind of throwing up new things in the process as I go of, what do I explore next? Do I explore that aspect of my personality, that aspect? But I'm still trying to bring other people in, other people's families, and explore my way through it as a writer, really. As my family, different elements, and as part of the MA, we're pushed into really experimenting with different materials and different practices, and just trying to find that how each individual word might work as a sequence eventually. That's it. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to have a quick Q&A if it helps, because I know it's quite a complex thing to put into 10 minutes. No?
Do you stand with
there's a question.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm going to throw my door in.
Yes, sure.
If I may. The 23andMe,
Yeah.
when I first came across it, I thought, that's very fascinating. And I mean, I haven't done it myself, but I would, it's quite expensive. And you've both spoken about it. But I wonder if it actually matters. Does it actually matter where we came from? And I just wonder if it's actually a little bit dangerous. Bearing in mind what's happened in the just recent years, to sort of reduce stuff to numbers, and bearing in mind that other people are going to get hold of all this data, and they'll be wanting to use it for their evil purpose.
I think it's great if white racists find that they've got ancestors in Turkey or something.